Welcome to the 10th episode in our close reading series on satire for the London Review of Books. I'm Clare Bracknell, a fellow of All Souls.
Well, I don't know how you can calmly sit there introducing a podcast while I'm doing the serious business of eating cucumber sandwiches. But I better say I'm Colin Burrow, also a fellow of All Souls. And for today's episode, we have leapt forward across the 19th century to 1895, which was peak cucumber sandwich.
Out of interest, am I going to be allowed one? Or
No.
Okay.
All for me.
All right, fine.
All right, cool.
Thank you. Okay, so 1895, it's the fin de siècle. Queen Victoria, very old. The mood is a combination of extremely straight-laced and wildly decadent.
Oh, wildly. Oh, I hope there are going to be lots of jokes like that as we go on.
Oh, yes. And we are going to zoom in on one particular night of that year, February the 14th, St. Valentine's Day. And it's opening night for the brilliant Irish playwright Oscar Wilde's new comedy, The Importance of Being Earnest, at the St. James Theatre in the West End. And you have to imagine everyone who is anyone is there to see the play, and to see Wilde himself, who had become, according to his friend Ada Leveson, as well known as the Bank of England.
They're a bit less thrifty, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah. So the first night goes off like a charm, everyone laughs in the right places, the press loves it. Wilde's wife, Constance, was there in the audience. His younger lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, aka Bosie, was abroad. And the person that Wilde least wanted to be present, Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, who was really one of history's most unpleasant characters, was also absent.
And that was the Queensberry of Queensberry rules in boxing. So, sort of pugilistic. And Wilde had cancelled Queensberry's ticket to the opening night, is that right? Fearing what he's going to get up to?
Yeah, because Queensberry was convinced that Wilde had corrupted.
Well, he had to sort of homosexually seduced.
Yeah, he had done.
Son,
Queensberry's son, exactly, yeah.
Yep. And during the months before the opening night of Ernest, Queensberry had been just doing everything he could to wreck Wilde's life. He's spreading scandal about his doings with Bosie and threatening physical violence and legal action, everything he could possibly do.
Yeah. So instead of being allowed in to enjoy the play like everyone else, Queensberry went prowling around outside, accompanied by a prize fighter who was carrying what's described always as a grotesque bouquet of vegetables, which we have to assume he'd planned to hurl at Wilde, in lieu of flowers. And then after 3 hours of this sinister prowling, he left the bouquet at the box office.
And a few days later, he went even further, didn't he? He left a card very publicly at Wilde's club on which he scrawled, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as Somdomite." And he did write Somdomite because he couldn't even bring himself to spell the word right. And if you look at the card, his handwriting is quite extraordinary. It's like an oscilloscope graph of human rage. And that sort of public accusation pushed Wilde just over the edge, really, and encouraged by Bosie, who hated his father, Wilde decided to sue Queensberry for libel. And it wasn't a very sensible thing to do, and the trial fell apart because Queensberry had found rent boys who would testify against Wilde and had got hold of compromising letters and had a full package of proof, so that tables then turned on poor self-destructive old Oscar. And soon he was facing criminal charges of his own for gross indecency and, well, what followed? Disgrace, bankruptcy, prison, hard labour, and when he was released from prison, miserable exile under a pseudonym abroad.
Yeah. So the first night of Ernest really was a sort of last night.
Yeah, and there's a little story for children, which Wilde wrote in 1888, a few years before all of this sort of brouhaha. But I think it is revealing about his self-destructive compulsions. It's called The Remarkable Rocket, and it's about a self-regarding rocket in the fireworks sense rather than the Elon Musk sense, who's convinced that everyone thinks he's remarkable and who speaks almost entirely in epigrams.
So he says things like, "I have always been of the opinion that hard work is simply the refuge of people who have nothing whatever to do."
And so on. So the rocket is, to use your great joke, wildly Wildean. Anyway, he fails to go off at the right moment and gets dumped in a ditch, and yet still manages to carry on thinking that he's wonderful. And then some kids find him and set him off, but he's so damp that they fall asleep before he bursts into flame. "Now I'm going to explode," he cried. "I shall set the whole world on fire and make such a noise that nobody will talk about anything else for a whole year." And he certainly did explode. Bang, bang, bang went the gunpowder. There was no doubt about it. But nobody heard him, not even the two little boys, for they were sound asleep.
Yeah, which is sort of how it worked out for Wilde in 1895.
Yeah.
So in April, after he was arrested, his name was removed from the hoardings of the theatres where Ernest and his other play, An Ideal Husband, were running still to large audiences. And then, because popular feeling was getting stormier and more moralistic by the day, the plays were taken off.
So bang, bang went the gunpowder and whoosh went his career in a shower of smoke.
And it's tempting, I think, and a lot of people have been tempted, to see Ernest as a sort of delightful, magical last hurrah in Wilde's career. You know, a comedy so light and so amusing and so perfect that it could only have been followed by darkness and disaster.
Yeah, and Richard Ellman, in his biography of Wilde from 1988, thinks of Ernest really as being that. He says, "Ernest constructs its wonderful parapet over the abyss of the author's disquietude and apprehension. By a desperate stratagem, Wilde keeps the melancholy of the world at a distance."
So, in other words, some part of him knew catastrophe was coming, and Ernest, with its lightness and its total nonchalance, was a sort of bulwark that he erected against his own fate.
Right. So he probably always wanted to be a remarkable rocket, I think, and also knew that the price of a gorgeous display was ultimately to go up in smoke. But today, because we are close readers, aren't we, Claire, we're going to try and think about what Wilde was trying to do with the importance of being earnest outside of that dark shadow of the future, which we know was coming, but he perhaps probably didn't.
Yeah. And later, during the years of his prison sentence, he wrote a long letter to Bosie, which was published in 1905 as De Profundis. And in it, he looks back on his life and he sees it in retrospect as always having been leading up to sorrow and suffering. But that wasn't the perspective he had when he wrote Ernest.
Or was it? Well, let's get down to business. How about we start with the segment our regular listeners so enjoy, a spoiler-heavy plot summary.
Hello to our regular listeners.
Hello.
Actually, there's a line in De Profundis that I think would make a good starting point. So early in the letter, Wilde refers to Bosie's wonderful series of telegrams to me with their strange mixture of romance and finance.
Which means that Bosie was both flirting with him and mercilessly sucking up huge amounts of his cash.
Yeah. And it strikes me that that combination, romance and finance, is in many ways the right phrase for Ernest.
Yeah.
It's a comedy, and a comedy of a traditional kind, because it features two young men and two young women, and by the end of the last act, those men and women are variously engaged to each other and about to be married. So that's the romance part.
And there are other sort of cod romance elements in the plot, aren't there? The discovery, for example, that one of the young men, an orphan with a mysterious birth story, is in fact the long-lost brother of the other young man. Very convenient.
Yes. And then the finance part is pretty much everything else. So a given of the play and of Wilde's theatrical worlds generally is that all the central characters are upper class. Their world is the world of the Mayfair drawing room and the country house weekend.
And so much of P.G. Wodehouse, I suppose, comes from that aspect of Wilde, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But as in Wodehouse, the drones of Mayfair are only able to marry their sylph-like beloveds if they have enough ready cash to do so.
Yeah. I mean, the late Victorian marriage market really did take no prisoners. And owning land wasn't enough. Land gives one position and prevents one from keeping it up. That's all that can be said about land, says Lady Bracknell.
Who is the true heroine of the play.
Absolutely, and we'll come back to Lady Bracknell, who is the prototype of P.G. Wodehouse's terrifying aunts, of course, as well, in a few minutes. But she's in charge of at least one of the young people in the play, and in her view, and in that of the hard-bitten aristocratic world that she represents, there is no romance without finance, at least on one side of the partnership.
Yeah, so witness this brilliant remark she makes about her marriage to the absent and we must assume long-suffering Lord Bracknell. I do not approve of mercenary marriages. When I married Lord Bracknell, I had no fortune of any kind, but I never dreamed for a moment of allowing that to stand in my way.
So we have a play with one foot in the world of romance and dream and one foot squarely in the world of funds and inheritances and government stocks. and which side of Belgrave Square is the nicest and things like that. It sounds like a very good recipe for satire, really, Claire.
It does, doesn't it? Well, we'll come back to the question of how far Ernest can be considered a satire in a bit. But for now, let's stay with the plot and the characters. Colin, who are the young people in the play?
The young people, I am a million years old. The young people are Algernon Moncrief and his frenemy Jack Worthing on one side, and on the other, because it is a sort of contest between the two sexes, I think, the Honourable Gwendolen Fairfax, who is Lady Bracknell's daughter, and Cicely Cardew, who is Jack's 18-year-old ward.
Yes, and Algernon and Jack are witty, lazy, languorous, fin de siècle types, along the lines of Lord Henry Wotton in the picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde's novel.
Yeah, and though Wotton is a dilettante figure who leads the formerly pure Dorian astray and makes him into a person whose decaying and ruined soul has to lodge in a portrait in the attic. To say the least, there tends to be a moral double edge to languorous youths in Wilde's work.
Yeah. But I think Algernon and Jack aren't seductive or dangerous in the way that Lord Henry is. But like him, they're careless lounge lizards who think that doing work is vulgar and have a sort of reduced capacity for normal human feeling. As far as the piano is concerned, sentiment is my forte, says Algernon. In other words, as far as the piano is concerned and no further.
And they meet their match in Gwendolen and Cicely, don't they? Because, both of those young women are fearsomely self-possessed, and they can be just as surgically biting in conversation as the men whenever they need to be biting.
Yeah. I don't like women who are interested in philanthropic work. I think it is so forward of them.
And that, I think, is more than just an illustration of the general truth that characters in Oscar Wilde tend on the whole to talk a bit too much like Oscar Wilde. I think he wants conversation to be all cut and thrust, and that means that his women, as well as his men, have to be rhetorically armed and dangerous. But Gwendolen and Cicely, despite their rhetorical sharpness, they don't know everything about their suitors, do they?
They do not. No, Jack and Algernon are not as they seem. What we learn in Act 1 via a telltale inscribed cigarette case is that Jack is called Jack when he's in the country, but he's Ernest in the town. So with Cicely, his young ward, he is Uncle Jack, the impeccable guardian, protector of female virtue, etc. But then in London with Algernon, he is Ernest, an extremely badly behaved 1890s decadent. He says, "In order to get up to town, I have always pretended to have a younger brother of the name of Ernest, who gets into the most dreadful scrapes."
And Algernon approves of that little scheme because it turns out that he also has an imaginary second persona that he wheels out to dodge boring social occasions.
Which, we all need one.
We all do need one. I have invented an invaluable permanent invalid called Bunbury in order that I may be able to go down into the country whenever I choose. If it wasn't for Bunbury's extraordinary bad health, I wouldn't be able to dine with you at Willis's tonight, for I've been really engaged to Aunt Augusta for more than a week.
So both men are, as Algernon says, confirmed and secret Bunburyists. That is, they lead fully fledged double lives.
And I suppose Bunburying is as good an instance as any of Wilde's self-destructive urge to hide his homosexuality in plain sight, because he was a married man, but he had as much need as Algernon for a Bunbury to explain away his nights of passion in the Savoy with Bosie. All right, so Algernon and Jack let us in on their secrets, and then Lady Bracknell, Algernon's aunt, arrives into his London flat with her daughter Gwendolen in tow, and Jack is delighted to see Gwendolen and seizes the opportunity, as all men do, when the others are out of the room, to propose to her.
And she is thrilled, and she makes it easy by exclaiming that her ideal has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest, which, luckily, is what she and everyone else in London thinks Jack is called.
And men called Ernest are for some reason the only men she'll consider marrying. There's something in that name that inspires absolute confidence.
So already you can see that the fake name is going to be a problem.
Thanks for listening to this extract from On Satire, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.